Now, a recent ABC News Washington Post poll has Hillary Clinton handily beating Donald Trump. But when asked if you could vote for a third party, would you? Well, it turns out the results are much more favorable to third party candidates than you would expect. Now, first, I want to show you through this poll how many people are unhappy with their choices. Well, according to the poll, full 57% of Americans do not like their current choices, whether it be Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. Whether you're a Republican and you're like, God, man, Donald Trump's a fucking disaster. He's a dumpster fire on wheels. Well, I don't want to vote for this guy. This guy's an idiot. For example, Charlie Sykes, right? The Republican radio host that came out and said, look, Donald Trump is a result of us basically bullshitting you for the past 20 years and feeding you facts and creating a false reality around everyone. We've insulated ourselves from reality, and Donald Trump was what we get. Now, I can understand why a lot of Republicans, the more sane ones, are going, I'm not comfortable with this. Like, yeah, this was pretty good for us. This was good for our bottom line, our profits, but this guy's crazy. He's fucking psycho. And I really, he's a disaster. I don't want to go anywhere near him. I don't want to vote for him. And then, of course, on the Democratic side, you have Hillary Clinton, who's not that great of a progressive. Okay, she's not very progressive at all. She is what you would be pretty much a center-right Democrat. On some things, she's even more to the right, for example, on foreign policy, than Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama campaigned as a progressive. He's done some good things. He's been an overall decent president. But you can argue, using a lot of facts, a lot of the policy positions that he's taken on his own. This is not counting the Congress and all that shit. When you look at Obama, what Obama's been trying to do, trying to do the Simpson Bowles deal, which is essentially austerity during the middle of an economic downturn, enshrining 94% of the Bush tax cuts into law permanently, something that George Bush could never even do, and then pushing for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You look at that and go, well, he's not necessarily all that progressive. He's a good centrist, sort of right-leaning on some issues, Democrat. Now you look at Hillary Clinton, and it pretty much promises to be the continuation of Barack Obama, which, look, as I pointed out, it's not that bad. Because Obama was a pretty decent president, but is he a progressive? Absolutely not. Is Hillary Clinton a progressive? Hell no. Not a progressive. It's a continuation of President Obama's policies, which I said have been decent, but not fantastic. Okay, and there's some serious structural problems that we have to solve in America that need progressive solutions. Healthcare, I can point as one example. We need some work on that, okay? And look, he's shown some initiative going more towards the public option. Too bad it's a little too late, when we actually could have had a public option when we were doing the beginning of the healthcare debate. But okay, whatever, right? As far as Hillary Clinton is concerned, she is a little bit further to the right when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to her willingness to invade other countries. I'm not exactly a fan of that, and most progressives aren't either. So, with that in mind, with those policy positions in mind, and that's just from the Democratic and Republican sides, right? It makes sense that 57% of Americans look at those choices and go, well, fuck me 2 ways sideways, man. That sucks. I don't like this at all. So, look. It's also, other than the policy positions, that 57% is also easier to explain with this stat. Only 9% of Americans voted for either Trump or Clinton in the primaries. Now, you want to talk about the tyranny of the minority, right? Well, this is a pretty good example. Only 9% of Americans voted in total for these two terrible candidates. Now, of course, what led to that partly is because there are a lot of people that were left out, that were disenfranchised, that were told that they couldn't vote in the primary, either because they didn't check a box stating that they were either a Democrat or a Republican, or they had their registrations changed. We saw a lot of that shit going on, or their polling place was closed by either Republicans or Democrats that just weren't interested in allowing you to vote. And then, of course, say, oh, no, we got to save money. We got to save money. We're in a budget crunch. Okay, yeah, sure. Now, that same poll asked how the American people would vote in a four-way race, including Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, the third-party candidates, right? Now, respondents to the ABC News Washington Post poll released August 7th gave Hillary Clinton an 8-point lead over Donald Trump, 45 to 37%. So that's a clear lead. Doing very, very well against Trump. Now, this is with Gary Johnson at 8% and Jill Stein polling at 4%. Okay, so that's roughly in line with where they've been. Actually, it's a little bit of a decrease for Gary Johnson, but a slight up increase in Jill Stein. Because most of the polls had her about 3%. She's now at 4%. Okay. Well, as I said, this is just one poll. Now, when you take a lot of the other polls, that seems fairly consistent with the rest of the mainstream polls, okay? That show, yes, Hillary Clinton still beating Donald Trump by a fair margin, and you've got Gary Johnson sitting around 9%, Jill Stein somewhere around 3 to 4%. Okay, great. Now, there's another poll, and this is where ABC News partnered up with SSRS Survey. Now, that is a polling research firm, and what they did is they got together and they did a poll online. And they asked randomly chosen respondents if they are considering voting for a third-party candidate. Now, how many people said yes? Roughly 35% of these respondents said, yes, I'm going to vote for I'm considering voting for a third-party candidate. Now, that is just over a third. A third of people that are so disgusted with the Clinton and Trump circus that they're looking at these third-party candidates, which generally most people don't look at during a general election, and they're looking at them going, that I might look into these people. Interesting. Now, of course, whenever we have this discussion about third-party candidates, immediately both sides are going to tell you, no, don't look at those guys. No. You need to fall in line and go for our candidate, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Now, Republicans will tell you to vote for Donald Trump, for example, because Hillary Clinton is Satan incarnate. Is she Satan incarnate? No. But are Republicans saying that? Absolutely. Now, the Democrats will come around and tell you that you need to vote for Hillary Clinton, you need to fall in line, or, something terrible is going to happen. We're going to elect Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is essentially Hitler. Is Trump Hitler? No. Is he saying some really scary rhetoric? Absolutely. Are there things about him that really throw up a lot of red flags? Of course. I've told you a lot of those stories about how Trump's kind of a moron, but he surrounds himself with dangerous people. Now, it's not saying that Hillary Clinton also doesn't surround herself with dangerous people. Mostly neocons. You've got war criminal Henry Kissinger. You've got John Negroponte. I mean, look, Hillary Clinton's not a bag of roses, okay? So she's dangerous, but she's also smart. Donald Trump's dangerous, but he's a moron and can be easily manipulated. Whereas Hillary Clinton does the manipulation. So there's a difference there. All right. Now, the rhetoric coming from both parties that I was pointing out is fear. And look, fear sells really, really well. In fact, this ABC News SSRS survey asked if these respondents were worried about the scenario of, hey, if we vote third party, then the party that the person we don't like is more likely to win. How worried are they? Well, it turns out that 59% are worried about that scenario, whereas 35% were somewhat worried, 15% were very worried, and 9% were extremely worried. And this is kind of where we're at. I mean, like I said, on the Democratic side, we have the establishment saying, hey, man, you better fall in line or else you're going to get Trump. You want Trump to win? And they're also invoking Nader, the 2000 election myth of it's Ralph Nader's fault that we got 8 years of George W. Bush. Well, let me just correct the record on that one, to borrow a phrase from Hillary Clinton's campaign, right? Ralph Nader didn't cause Al Gore to lose the election. In fact, Al Gore actually won the popular vote. So the Republican Party in the Supreme Court ended up, even though Gore won the popular vote, they handed this election over to George W. Bush. In fact, in a 2004 article, Tony Shinella wrote about how the Supreme Court stepped in to basically give this election over to Bush. Now, he writes, on Saturday, December 9th, 5 conservative members of the U.S. Supreme Court ordered a halt to the vote counting at the request of Bush's legal team. Antonin Scalia, the late Antonin Scalia, said in a concurring opinion, wrote that the counting threatened irreparable harm to Bush by, quote, casting a cloud upon what he claims to be the legitimacy of this election. Subsequent to the stay, no votes were ever again officially counted in the Florida presidential election. On Tuesday, December 12th, the same 5 justices held that the decision of the Florida Supreme Court violated the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment. In general, the Equal Protection Clause requires that the persons in similar circumstances be treated equally by the laws. The majority said that the standard announced by the Florida Supreme Court for counting the undervotes, namely a vote should be counted if there is, quote, a clear indication of the intent of the voter, violated equal protection. The court claimed that because different Florida counties might apply different standards of what constitutes clear intent by the voter, an identical balance might not be counted the same way. According to the majority, such an outcome was constitutionally impermissible. They said the Florida Supreme Court should have articulated a more uniform standard for counting the undervotes. Additionally, the 5 conservatives ruled that December 12th was the legal deadline for Florida's presidential votes to be counted. Because this was the same date as their decision, they concluded there was no time to send the case back to the Florida court for a more uniform standard to be set and the counting to resume. The upshot to their actions, he writes, was that Bush was declared the election's winner even though thousands of valid votes had not been counted. They gave that election to Bush, the Supreme Court. This is a clear case of judicial activism. Now, finally, anybody who knows basic math tells us that when somebody voted for Nader in 2000, Bush's tally didn't go up and Gore's tally did not go down. That's not what happens. In fact, not only that, but this man explains that in Florida, CNN's exit polling showed Nader taking the same amount of votes from both the Republicans and the Democrats. 1%. So they both took equally from both parties, right? Nader also took 4% of the independent vote, and at the same time, Nader took a whopping Bush took a whopping 13% of the Democratic vote in Florida. 13% of Democrats. It's not Nader that pushed us into a Bush presidency. It was the 13% of Florida Democrats that helped make the election close enough to get the Supreme Court involved, who of course gave it to George Bush, despite Al Gore still winning the popular vote. So the problem here is that it's not necessarily the third candidate spoiled it for the rest. It's the fact that Democrats and Republicans keep putting up bad candidates and use fear to drive votes. And look, when people don't like the candidates, they either stay home, and when they stay home, they don't get involved. And of course, if there happens to be an election that's close enough, in the case of 2000, the Supreme Court could step in and say, oh, wait a minute. We don't know what's going on, but we can do what we did in 2000. Now, that's not necessarily likely to happen again in that case. So this whole thing about Nader being a spoiler, this whole thing about any third-party candidate being a potential spoiler, doesn't really hold up when you look at the facts. Now, look, Trump is bad. I know this. Is he worse than Hillary Clinton? When it comes to policy, in my opinion, yes, he is bad. Now, that doesn't mean that Hillary Clinton is fantastic. And the fact that third parties are doing so well this time around than historically before is not necessarily by accident. It's not an accident. These are two deeply flawed, terrible candidates. Now, with all this said, I'm not advocating that you vote for, Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, or I'm not advocating that you vote for Clinton either. I'm just saying that overall, this election aside, we need better choices. And the only way to get better choices is to really get more involved in the primaries, to get more of the American people involved in the primaries, as well as pressure our political parties to open up these primaries. You have to get more people involved. We need the vast support of independents, people who don't just check that box for one party. We need them involved. And we need good people to get in there and to run. As far as being a progressive, I want to see more good progressives run in these primaries, like what Bernie Sanders did. Now, what happened to Bernie Sanders was terrible, right? There was a lot of shady shit going on. The DNC, of course, was against him to begin with. And that just shows, I mean, if anything, all of that shows the failings of the primary system. What we need to do is we need to get more people involved so we can fix that system so that we're not only left with the choice of 9% of the electorate. You've got to remember that the primaries are the most important elections. They're more important than the general. They're vastly important to who we're going to put up as president. That's why we need to get involved, and that's why this is so important. Hey everybody, if you like this video, then please like this video and share. And if you want to see more like this, then please hit that subscribe button below.